if we disable this subdivision surface modifier, we still have these smooth surfaces. No texture stretching is happening. Welcome back to Blender Frenzy. I am Justin, and in the last video we did our initial bake for our whole pile of 1,000 rolls of toilet paper, but I had a couple problems, and in this video we're going to fix one of them, and that is a weird issue we're getting with texture stretching when we disable our subsurface modifier, and that has to do with our UV seams, so we're going to be changing those, and we're going to pick up right where we left off in the last video, so let's get started. There is another problem here that you can't see yet, and that's because we still have our subsurf modifier enabled. I'm going to just disable that. And look at that ugliness. What is this? You can see all this banding here that's going on. And this honestly took me forever to figure out, like months, like a couple months at least. I could not figure out what was going on here. But this is actually not banding because we don't even have light in our scene right now. This is all baked. And so I was like, why, when I enable this subsurf modifier, they go away, and when I disable it, they appear? Well, this is actually, if you look close enough, it's texture stretching. And that is due to the way that I've unwrapped the object here. And let's go and take a look at that. So let's enable that, and let's go into edit mode. And so you can see, let's find one. Let's get rid of that 3D cursor. Okay, you can see that I do not have a seam around the outside here. So there's no seam here, so basically it's unwrapping like this. It's kind of flattening it out like that. And for whatever reason, it stretches that texture even when you're baking lighting. And I've tried every which way for baking. I tried using a cage, using another object, and tried baking from high poly to low poly. I've tried everything, and it still doesn't work with, at least not with this many objects at once, because I didn't want to do it for one by one on each of them. And I don't actually remember why we had to get rid of the seam on the outside. I think it had to do with some texture painting stuff, but that's not important right now. What is important is that we add it back so that we can unwrap that a little bit more smoothly. Now I know that originally we had that seam just opposite the one in here, so I'm just going to select that one for reference and rotate around and make sure I select the right one over here, right click and mark seam. Now in order to transfer this to all of the rest of them here, I need to separate all of these into individual parts. Now it is important to note that I am using one of these from the pile itself. Now you don't have to mark the seam before you separate them, but you can't use your original toilet paper roll, which is using the wrong UVs right now anyway. But we can't use this original one because it doesn't actually have the same quad assignments, I think. Anyway, something about the mesh doesn't translate anymore now that we have the pile in one object and we're separating all those out. Again, not important. I'm going to make another video about that in the future. But for now, just know that if you want to change anything on your mesh, pick one from your current pile that you have. And of course, before I do this, I'm going to right click and duplicate that collection and disable this just so we have something to fall back on as always. Okay, so go back in here, type P, and then separate by loose parts. Well, let's go out into object mode and then select this one again, back into edit mode. Looks like it didn't keep that seam here, so we're gonna have to make that seam again, which is fine. Right click and mark seam. Okay, so now with that seam marked, back out into object mode, select this one first, and then right click and select all of the rest of them. And now all I have to do is come up to object, go to relations, and then transfer mesh data. And then click UV seam, and then this pops up down here, and then choose edge mapping topology. Let's just go into edit mode with all of them. And now you can see all of them should have that edge going down the outside of the roll there, which is what we want. Okay, so now we need to unwrap this again. So let's go back to UV editing, select all of them, and then I'm gonna not overwrite this pile. So I'm gonna create a duplicate, name this pile 2, And we'll also make that the active render, mouse in the viewport, U, and then unwrap. And now we zoom in here. That is good. Now see the difference here? We have straight strips where the edges here on the top and the bottom are where that seam that we created is. And if we look at our pile, how come that isn't changing? Well, let's change it here. So let's go pile. Okay, so my Blender just crashed, and not only did it crash, but I did not save anything from this tutorial. So I had to go back and do it all again, and that is a perfect reason why you should always save often and save in iterations, and I didn't do any of that. But I'm back, and I actually ran into a few problems trying to do everything again. And let me show you a problem I ran across. If for some reason you can't, let's go back here. So if you're trying to separate these by loose parts, so that you can change some of the UVs and then transfer them back, I ran into a problem where it says the edges aren't the same. You don't have the same amount of edges to what you're transferring to. And I'm like, yes, I do. And I checked. That's why I have this information up here, which by the way, you can come and turn on your statistics here. And if you select each of these, you can see, well, um, after they're all selected individually, you can see that each of them had 208 edges. I was like, what is going on? Well, the reason it was acting up, I think, is because my subdivision surface modifier, when that's enabled and then I separate all into loose parts, apparently that doesn't like it with the whole transferring the UV seams. It gets confused. So just make sure you have this checked off before you separate loose parts. That way you can do all your stuff to your edges that you need to do and transfer those seams over just fine. Just a little tidbit of information that I just found out. Okay, but anyway, let's go back. And now it's working. I think hopefully I'm going to save it right now. Let's just make sure. Okay, so we've unwrapped our pile 2 with that seam going down the outside edges, and that's what this looks like. If we select our pile original, this is what our outside edges look like. I believe that this is the top and this is the bottom. So it just kind of basically took that cylinder and went and flattened it out, which gave us our texture stretching that we saw. And so we re-unwrapped it with the seam going down the middle, and that's what we should have currently, and that is what we want. So let's go to our shading, and now we can bake using those UVs. So again, what I'm going to do is make sure our pile is selected. We've got to have our diffuse going into our surface and our light on, because that's what we're baking. We're baking the light, so we actually have to have our diffuse and our actual light bounces. So let's check this out in our cycles render, and that looks all right. Let's just quick check our floor here to make sure that is okay. Yeah, that looks good. So down here, we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. Make sure our pile 2 is selected and active render. Let's go to our subdivision and make sure that is enabled. And now let's go to our render, make sure we're still at 128 for our samples. And then we've got our bake, our diffuse, and then all 3 of these are checked here, direct, indirect, and color. And the last thing that we have to do is make sure our placeholder is selected. That is what we're going to bake onto. From here, it's going to go and bake onto there. So, oh yeah, and our margin is at 2 pixels, which is good. That's what we had at last time. And bake. And this clear image here, basically what it does is, or at least what it's supposed to do, yeah, there we go, is it clears everything out that was there before on our placeholder, or whatever image you're doing that on. So we're going to let this bake, and we will see what we have with our new UV unwrap. Okay, and here is our new UV unwrap. We're going to just go ahead and plug that in right here. And because I know that this is the unwrap that I want, I'm going to go ahead and save it here. So I'm going to come up here. Let's just stretch this out just a little more. Is that going to change? No, that's not going to change that. Let's just right click and then show menus. I don't like it that it bunches those up here. Okay, image, save a copy. And in our materials, I'm going to name this pile shadow bake 1. And then I'm going to change this from 8 to 16 and then save. Okay, so let's go in our material preview mode here, and not sure why it's like that. So I'm going to just duplicate this here, and let's go open up the one we just saved, pile shadow bake. I have this sorted by date modified, so I know the one I need is going to always be at the top. And then we'll just plug that one back in there. I don't know what Blender is really finicky right now for some reason, because this is this, and it should be exactly the same as what we just saved out. No idea what's going on there. So yeah, anyway, goes our layout, this material preview mode, and turn off our overlays. And now we have another bake with our shadows. We still have splotchy shadows, but we'll fix those in another video. But now you can see, let's go here and scroll in. And if we disable this subdivision surface modifier, we still have these smooth surfaces. No texture stretching is happening, which is awesome. But of course, you've probably noticed these really nasty seams going through the outside of our rolls. And so basically we've gotten rid of one problem only to replace it with another. So we still have two things we need to fix. But these blotchy shadows and the seams are actually fairly easy to fix. So that is what we're going to do in the next video. So stay tuned and you'll see me over there.